What's going on, fellow YouTubers, subscribers, fellow pitmains, all you lovely people? Just want to thank y'all so much for clicking on the video today. And I also just want to say thank you real quick for the results on my last video. 1,000 or however much it was at this point. That's definitely a lot more than what I could have asked for on that video. I just want to thank you guys so much for all the positive feedback and everything else that's just been going on with the video. I got more subscribers, just noticed numbers on my channel going up in general. So just want to thank you guys again so much for that. But yeah, with that, I can't really recall when and where I came up with this video idea in particular. I think maybe back when I was recording the arrow segment for the last video. There were plenty of things shown in that video involving the arrow as well. At the same time, I didn't really want to cover anything in that video, as it could have just made it a bit too long. And it was a bit far off from the focus of the video. And with this video, I'd like to give more insight to players on why Palutena Bow truly makes Pit stand apart from his doppelganger in many ways. And of course, some techniques and everything that I'm talking about in this video will also apply to Dark Pit. But yeah, similar to the last video, I'm going to start with the grounded options. So when Pit's on the ground, you have the standard arrow where you just press B and let the arrow fly, and you have the B reverse option, which is primarily a mix-up tactic. You can do things like fake out shooting in one direction and turn around immediately to hit the opponent. And the grounded arrow aimed upwards also has slightly less cooldown frames than the standard version. It can be used as a fake out, anti-aerial. It can force frame traps to either punish landings or extend the juggling advantage. And the list goes on, really. Dash dance can be used in conjunction with wave bounce arrow to either turn around and hit the opponent if they drop shield, or you can aim it upwards and hold in diagonally on the L stick to buffer a turnaround. And once you buffer a turnaround, you can immediately go for a down tilt, which is faster and safer than F tilt. It also has more combo potential, although F tilt will kill at those higher percentages. And if you turn around and arrow hits their shield, you can input down tilt if you're outside of your opponent's immediate punish range to pressure their shield, which is super useful with Dark Pit especially, since Silver Bow and Electroshock Arm have slightly more shield stun, or I'm not entirely sure how it works exactly, but I think the more damage a move does, I'm gonna guess the more shield stun the opponent has. But I have noticed Dark Pit with dark arrows or the Silver Bow and Electroshock Arm can keep an opponent in shield a bit longer than Palutena Bow and other dash arm. But for the most part, if your opponent isn't thrown off by the B reverse movement mix-ups or it becomes predictable, they can be punished, though how severe the punish depends greatly on how far away Pit is from the opponent and the other character's range. In some cases, if you're able to release arrow at the right position, that allows you to go for a max range or close to max range down tilt, which comes out on frame 6. This can make the arrow a bit safer on block, but you don't want to be throwing the arrows out at close range in general. It's just not the safest option if the opponent blocks or they see it coming. And if you are in range from the opponent, jab is an even safer option as it comes out even faster than down tilt. But with all this said, arrows are still going to be a lot safer at a distance, especially since no one's spacing is 100% perfect. And if anything, these options are meant to help you better understand how the opponent simply likes to react to this move, or rather create an opportunity, as you also get to see what they like to choose against this move, whether it's before or after the arrow. So you kind of get to see what options they like to pick. If they have a block arrow or if they're a projectile character, you get to see their patterns and how they like to move around it. So it kind of varies in that regard, but I'll try to touch up on that more as I go through the video. So overall, it's better to pick and choose as you go than it is to stick to one strategy. And a general rule of thumb, especially in neutral when you're grounded, is to aim the arrow upwards. If the opponent shields the arrow, aiming the arrow upwards doesn't really make a difference, but it does ensure that if they attempt to jump or just do any type of hop or whatever out of shield, that option is pretty much covered by the arrow, and it can discourage a lot of players from even jumping at all in neutral. Not entirely, but it is just another form of conditioning to keep in mind, especially as hit. So from here, you're left with the two options to either cover the jump or just go for the raw damage. In the air, Pit's arrow has a lot less lag, allowing it to be used in rapid succession with Pit's almost non-existent double jump squad. You also get to play a lot more offensive in the air. Similar to Akuma in Street Fighter, aiming the projectiles at a descending arc can be quite the oppressive offensive strategy. Although in matchups versus heavy projectile characters, you often won't win the projectile war, as most of those characters have multiple projectiles as opposed to just one. And because of this, Dark Pit becomes a better candidate in most scenarios versus these type of matchups. In the midst of approaching a zoner, you're going to be focused on getting your hands on the opponent, so Dark Pit's making up a big difference whenever his arrows actually connect, doing far more damage with it than Pit and killing a lot earlier as well. Next sort of technique I want to talk about is full hop rising Akuma arrow into jump arrow over and over without touching the ground and being forced into jump squat startup. This is huge for Pit, as this method basically gives him one hell of an offensive presence with the ability to weave in and out while spamming Akuma arrows. It has flaws such as not working against opponents directly below you and not being too good in disadvantage. This method also only works because we're aiming arrow downwards, as Pit can't fire another arrow until his current one disappears, whether it hits a shield, a solid surface, or the opponent themselves. He just can't fire another one until that first one is gone. Meaning any attempt to spam arrows will fail if you don't collide with something in time before or not before the arrow, but I guess before it lands back on the ground and you're forced into going for another full hop double squat. Silver Bow can also be curved slightly, though they're a lot easier to jump over, which also means Silver Bow also just doesn't have any Akuma arrows. Both of them can be reversed in the air, making them better upon retreat, as well as a wave bounce, canceling momentum turns a bit further, which basically just means like the same wave bounce you do on the ground. Once you do in the air, it actually looks like it turns your momentum around a lot further. But it's the movement where you move into one direction, press B, and then instantly flick the L stick in the opposite direction. Arrow can also be wave bounced onto platforms. When off stage, arrows can force air dodges on most of the casts. There are of course characters like Snake and Yoshi who often try to recover high. And in some cases, a character jumping with the airspeed of Falco or Yoshi, attempting to guide the arrow and aim directly at them can prove a bit difficult. And how I do my, I guess, Akuma arrow spamming more consistently, at least for me, is I changed one of my shoulder buttons to a special. And I know in the last video I said I changed one of them to jump as well. But for me, I actually use the X button to jump with my right bumper to use special, and then I pretty much just hold down on the L stick, and then from there I'm able to spam Akuma arrows. And when aiming directly at people, I usually found my arrows well guided and poorly timed, or vice versa. So I then learned to hold in the L stick in one direction and circle the arrow around, as though the rim outside of the L stick helps you curve shots in the form of a letter C. The rim is key in this section in particular, as holding the L stick into the rim is way faster than trying to slowly and carefully maneuver the L stick where you want it, as far as like when you're trying to aim arrow. So, and doing so allows the arrow to cover a specific area being guided by the L stick rim a lot faster as well. This enables you to not only reach the target quickly and more accurately, but you're also not stuck in that weird spot of trying to aim after arrows been released. from my experience, most of the arrows I actually hit, I had their trajectory framed out in my mind ahead of time. So let's say Ike, for instance, wants to charge side B up high and recover onto the stage above the ledge after being launched to one of the side blast zones. Unless I'm really on point, I'm not going to try to guide the arrow directly to him, because whether he's still charging side B or just released it, there's always a small mind game of where he's going to be while the arrow is still being held by Pit and after it's been released. He's still falling while charging the side B as well, so in theory, if Ike doesn't release the side B in time, I may very well just aim at the spot where he'd be if he were to continue falling while charging. And of course, that the time I release that would have to be according with the amount of time I've been charging arrow as well, because the longer you charge arrow, the faster it's gonna fly, but of course the longer you're charging it, the more Ike's falling as well, and that's gonna change where your target will be. However, the same tactic can be applied if one decides to aim where they'd be after releasing the side B, only this time your intended trajectory needs to be in coordination with the time you choose to release arrow. It's this very rock, paper, scissors dynamic that comes with preemptive aiming that makes post-release arrow guidance rather hit or miss. Not that it can't be done, but after a couple of years of attempting myself, I eventually came to realize that my aim just ain't always on point. And it's a little difficult to explain, but there's a certain feel needed when guiding Pit's arrow that if you've got down, the only arrows you're missing were either dodged, blocked, reflected, etc. In other words, mastery over arrow movement itself isn't the hardest part. It more or less just comes down to consistency. It's not like PK Thunder, which moves slow enough for the user to easily be able to guide and maneuver it almost anywhere. Not only that, but it lingers long enough for players to either have one more attempt at hitting their opponent or rocket themselves into them. Palutena bow is much faster, so unlike PK Thunder, each arrow only has a single chance of actually hitting the opponent. And although there is relatively low cooldown after the arrow, Pit can't fire another arrow until the current arrow disappears. There's also the small issue of Pit kind of having to, I guess, move with his arrow if it stays on screen long enough. Like sometimes if I want to aim arrow, let's say directly in front of him, and then curve it all the way above him, and so it even goes behind him, I notice he ends up walking back like by the time that I'm curving the arrow. So it's a little quirk that can either help or hinder Pit in some scenarios. So that's just something to always keep in mind. But yeah, it's just another example to give you guys of how long arrow actually keeps Pit in this, I guess, framework or idle animation where he can't fire another arrow. Or I'm not sure if he can't do anything at all, but yeah, you only get one arrow. Once that's gone, then you can fire another one, allowing Ike in this example to make it back to center stage for free if arrow misses. This makes arrow more committal in advantageous scenarios, especially in ones where Pit can be more outgoing and actually walk off stage and hit his opponent. So when it comes down to it, arrows are almost always the option to pressure anyone far away off stage, as Pit's aerial mobility is pretty lackluster and doesn't allow him to chase anyone very well. And although Pit has the clear advantage of being able to curve his arrows vertically up and down, Silverbow still has better pressure off stage because it actually kills just a lot sooner than Pit's. With you being able to hold the charge and angle it slightly, as well as being able to jump with it, Dark Pit does just overall have a more offensive presence with his arrow whenever the opponent's off stage. But in any case, Pit still has the advantage of being able to aim at characters high above or directly below the stage. And there's also the slight advantage of Pit being able to actually curve his arrows, let's say up or downward, so that if he actually does get reflected by an opponent, it doesn't hit him. So for example, if you shoot an arrow at Falco, he reflects it, and it's about to come back to you. If you just aim slightly upward before it hit the reflector, it'll actually just go right back into the ground. And if you aim slightly downward, it'll just go right back into the air, and it'll miss Pit entirely. The same kind of goes for Dark Pit. He just can't aim his arrows up or down as well, so they don't curve as much. But if you're at a good enough distance, that arrow usually is going to miss you if you try to do the reflector counterplay, as I just mentioned. When it comes to disadvantage, arrow is usually far less effective. If blocked by an opponent right next to you, it can be punished, and it doesn't really do anything for you in the corner. Far off stage is where you'd have more room to openly fire. They can still harass or at the very least force shield against opponents on stage, and they can also cover Pit's recovery to the ledge while he's jumping. The strategy is a little risky though, as arrow loses to a lot of different stronger hitboxes, namely disjoints, which usually power through arrow and cleave right into Pit, so that's definitely not good. The only strategy that works for me sometimes if I'm directly above the opponent trying to make it to the ground is curving the arrow all the way underneath Pit. While not the most practical form of recovery, seeing how the opponent reacts and which direction they move into can create an opening to either land safely or for you to actually connect the arrow on them and then maybe try to juke them up from there and take a stock. Most people don't fall for it, but it's those very few times that they do that make it worthwhile. At least for me anyways. Okay, so now I want to kind of talk about more trick arrows, and I guess to elaborate more on using the rim of the L stick to aim arrows. As mentioned earlier, if you fire an arrow and basically hold directly up or down on the L stick after firing the arrow, you'll get what we'll call the letter C. Next is letter J, which is the same input as C, only you have to charge it a bit longer and input the up or down direction on the L stick a bit later than before, which gives you kind of a hook-like motion on the arrow. And there's of course the option to hold up or down on the L stick before shooting the arrow. Or in the case of the version where Pit's already aiming upwards, you can hold up, and once you release speed, just hold to the left or right and it'll give you the same kind of motion. The last trick arrow on my list is the noodle, which is done by holding and wiggling the L stick in one corner of the rim. It's overall a much more effective way of aiming faster, more powerful arrows, at least for those who aren't quite used to aiming straight forward. That, and with no charge, the arrow is too slow to be of any use when utilizing the noodle. But yeah, the input for the noodle arrow is basically the same as SDIing out of multi-hits. Just wiggle in one direction after launch, and boom, you're looking like Zeno Zoldyck out here. This being an alternate version of the straightforward arrow means you can wiggle in each direction, up diagonally, down, left, or right. And you can also give a slight wiggle on the L stick for the arrow to resemble the letter S. So a short little recap, we have the letters C, J, and the noodle. And there are of course more ways to utilize arrow. These are just, from what I know, some of the most notable playstyles. They're unique in that each one covers a set area of space shaped and mapped out differently by your motions on the L stick. Alongside the straight arrow or the angled ones, these are all of the known possibilities when it comes to directional arrow influence, at least to my knowledge. Each angle and shot has its own distinct advantages and flaws, but their purpose is all the same: pressure and limit certain options from the opponent. Curve arrows like C and J are slower because low or zero to no charge on arrow allows it to basically cruise through its trajectory, giving you a lingering hitbox more likely to intercept the opponent, though it is outclassed by the charged version if the target is too far away. Charged arrows are better in general at the really long ranges, as they have a wider curve radius and cover a great space as though it were a wall. Again, I personally like to think of it as option coverage as opposed to aiming directly for a target, but it may be easier for some people to aim straight for the opponent. But on the cool, I like the quote-unquote option coverage more, since all a curve arrow involves is holding in a direction on the L stick. So for me, it's just easier, because if you've a trajectory mapped out in mind, the only timing that needs to be on point is the release of the B button. As noted in the example with Ike, if you decide to predict that he'll release side B before arrow reaches him and you want to aim in front of him, from there the only thing that needs to be on point is your release of the B button, because if that's what you're banking on, you already have the trajectory pretty much mapped out in mind, or at least the more experienced pit players do. And for those that I guess are having trouble with that or haven't gotten to that point yet, holding in on the L stick and I guess just keeping your eye on the opponent and waiting to release that B button, that's basically the easiest way I can explain how to do most of this. And that's why I like the curve arrows, because again, you don't really have to aim directly at anyone, and you're still using the arrows effectively to a point where still has to respect them, and you're still cutting off options in neutral, advantage state, all that good shit. Noodle arrows are mainly a gimmick tool, though I found some use for them in scenarios where I personally was unsuccessful with the curve arrows, like if I really wanted to hit the opponent. When aimed upwards post-launch, it always made connecting the arrow much easier for me, since again, aiming at a falling opponent that can trick you up on the recovery or still has a jump left, won't have much trouble against some of the more straightforward arrows. And when mixed in properly with up air, the combo can keep almost any character occupied when above pit. And aside from this, the only real use I see for the noodle is being able to, of course, control faster and stronger arrows a lot easier. So if you really want to get that big damage with pit and connect the arrow, that's just another method of doing it, I guess. Overall, these are in no way the set in stone way to use arrows, more or less just general ideas and tactics that help me make more optimized decisions on the arrow while choosing which option I want to cover, sometimes while or usually before I begin to press the special button. Eventually, most pit players sort of have their own way or tactics of arrow usage, because despite how much I've spoken on option coverage and pre-commitment, whether it be arrow upwards while grounded in neutral to cover jumps and short hops, or throwing a character off stage and aiming arrows slightly upwards to cover a potential jump, aiming directly for the opponent is always an option. The only thing as mentioned earlier is the mind games and of course the accuracy that comes with aiming directly for the opponent. Not everyone is on Swift, so the curves and angles are merely methods to make up for that when comparing to perfect accuracy. So none of Pit's throws, or really any of his moves in general, like true combo into arrow. As I said earlier, most of the arrows, it's mainly used as a follow-up / chase tool at the end of a combo. If you launch someone and they end up outside of your immediate like punish or the threat zone, you can just aim arrow at them to basically force frame traps, hit them for more damage, etc. And anytime you launch someone a good enough distance and they're in range of arrow, it should pretty much be used on the spot. Because Pit doesn't have a lot of airspeed to chase anyone that well, using arrow as your go-to follow-up tool can lead to a lot of damage in frame trap scenarios. And although Pit's ability to juggle and edge guard with the bow itself shouldn't be understated, as mentioned before, Pit's aerial speed is just too slow, so arrow is just useful if you don't have a follow-up or you can't immediately threaten the opponent with a juggle or edge guard attempt. Most of the 50-50s in mind games can occur in this phase as well. They're the same in that when arrow is in, for this instance, pursuit mode on the opponent, and I've launched them too far away horizontally to get any sort of follow-up, the opponent still has the option to jump over the arrow while Pit can curve it upwards to catch the jump. Albeit a bit difficult to perform on reaction while the arrow is active, but holding the charge and waiting for the jump, whew, easy money, easy money. Literally just hold arrow and release it on reaction to double jump. Now of course how high up you aim the arrow varies on character jump height and speed. To catch a jump like Mario, straight up with a slight angle can do the job. This can also be applied when following up after forward / back throw at higher percentages where you can't follow up with any physical attacks. Okay. And I want to emphasize the higher percentage deal, as holding in the L stick opposite from the direction an arrow was fired gives you the closest ranged curve shot, and if the opponent isn't in front or directly above you, for the straight arrow, you'll of course have to rely on angles and curves, but there's a very specific space, so like kind of diagonally in front and above pit, where arrows simply cannot connect. And if you're caught using arrow in this specific zone, you can be punished pretty hard. Just a little tidbit, because sometimes I'll launch someone away, and if I'm chasing or juggling the opponent with arrow and they happen to fall into this specific space while falling, they're out of range of both the face forward curve up arrow and the face up curved forward arrow, if that didn't confuse you. While on the subject of advantage state, the core part of Pit's gameplay, in some ways at least, is gimping. I stated earlier when talking about reacting to or preemptively punishing a jump with arrow, knowing the opposing character matchup certainly helps in this department as well. Ultimately, the main goal, hit them and stop them from recovering, remains the same. Only the tactics involved in approach to said goal vary greatly in different matchups. Poor and slow recoveries like Little Mac and K-Rool are at the mercy of Palutena Bow, whereas recoveries that either have a lot of iframes or where they just teleport, much like the goddess herself, can prove a bit more difficult to snipe. So you'll generally just want to go out and either hit those characters or fall back to ledge traps.
動機の言語化か。あまり好きじゃないしな。しかし案外、いや、やはりと言うべきか。自分をつかむ鍵はそこにあるか。
In other words, I autopilot like a but in all seriousness, if I had to describe my playstyle with arrow, honestly, I said it throughout the video, I often value option coverage over directly aiming for the opponent. My mindset with it in neutral is definitely usually conditioning. I say usually because it can vary in certain matchups, but most players, depending on their character, like to, of course, jump a lot in neutral, which is something Pit can counter and use to condition players. The same principles sort of apply when in advantage state as well. In a juggling or edgeguard scenario, when the opponent's airborne, I like to arrow to keep the opponent in disadvantage by aiming arrow at their best escape route. And this, I believe, is the biggest defining difference between Pit and Dark Pit. In an edgeguard scenario, the pros and cons are pretty cut and dry. Pit has superior gimping potential and can hit opponents far above or below the ledge, while Dark Pit has more knockback, thus greater kill potential. In the middle of a string or at the end of a combo, or anytime your opponent is above Pit, this is where the differences, I think, truly matter. Pit can force certain options out of the opponent by cutting off another and go for direct damage where Dark Pit may be unable to. This is generally why I prefer to play Pit, but the ability to at least slightly curve arrow up and down and jump with it does help Dark Pit in this case just a little bit, especially for me when it comes to dubs, where you're not going to get a whole lot of trying to focus on Pit's arrow tricks. There's some pretty neat setups and tricks you can do with it in dubs, but for the most part it's just not the focus of my gameplay when I play in dubs, so yeah, I'll just go for more damaging arrows. But yeah, that's the sum of my playstyle. Hope it was a good enough explanation for everyone, as well as the rest of the video, because that's about all on my list. I know this wasn't my most in-depth video, but I hope this answers any of your questions regarding the subject. And again, thanks so much for the recent support. It definitely gives me more incentive to make these kind of videos. Would I still be doing them without the notoriety? Probably, because it does mean something to know that content I've made actually helps someone. But at the same time, I'd probably be more into just regular gameplay videos as opposed to videos where I gotta kind of get my thoughts together. I'm not too good at that, so I apologize if at any point in the video it sounded like I was rambling or just talking about something random or that was off topic or whatever. But as always, I'd very much appreciate any feedback you guys have for me, and if you have any questions for me, I'd love to read what you guys have to say in the comments. And until my next video, y'all be easy. Catch y'all next time. Peace.